Snowy owls are the largest owls in North America. They can have a wingspan of 5 feet, weigh 4 to 6 pounds, and have 14 vertebrae in their necks, which allows them to swivel their heads 270 degrees. These birds breed in the Arctic tundra, but migrate south in the winter months. It's uncommon for these owls to be seen as far south as the nation's capital, and rarer still to be seen perching just a few blocks north of the White House. But in January of 2014, that's what happened.
Everybody knew about the snowy owl. The snowy owl had been a celebrity for, I think, at least about 3 weeks in McPherson Square. And the city's filled with ornithologists. So word got out immediately that there was a snowy in town. And McPherson Square apparently had a lot of ornithologists and birders going and taking pictures of it because it was sitting on an awning. It was in full view. We were happy to know that there was a snowy in town. And I don't think it ever occurred to us that it would actually become a patient of ours.
An eruption is the migration of a species outside of its typical range. In the winter of 2013 to 2014, an eruption of snowy owls was seen up and down the East Coast. J.F. Therian, who studies snowy owls in their Arctic breeding grounds, says lemmings have a lot to do with the owls' numbers.
The thing is, what creates an eruption in lemmings and then in snowy owl it seems to be a combination of factors with snow depth, temperature, and plant material available. So at our study site where we worked, most of the time, some years you have no snowy owl breeding at all, so no chicks. And then a year with medium or high lemming abundance, you can have a bunch of nests, and then all those nests might raise about 2 or 3 chicks. And then if you have a record year like that's been seen in the last summer, we believe most of the clutches, most of the eggs ended up fledgling. So snowy owl can have a clutch of about 7 eggs in average, so from 4 to 11. So they can raise large clutches.
3,000 miles away from its breeding grounds, the snowy started hunting in McPherson Square. But in the early morning hours of January 30th, he got in trouble, colliding first with a bus and then with an SUV.
A snowy owl that has enchanted the area is bloody, bruised, and has a broken toe. D.C. police found the snowy owl Thursday morning and turned it over to the National Zoo, dazed and confused.
The zoo, by 7:30 in the morning, had called Alicia at our center, who comes in early, and said, "We have the snowy." And Alicia drove over to the zoo and got it immediately.
When it got here, it was acting what I like to call cobwebbed. Kind of had some neurological signs, not acting completely right. There was a fairly big wound on the foot, on the left foot. One of the toes we later found out was broken. But other than that, I think it was mostly internal. After later inspection, I realized that the feathers had been singed and damaged. And so I knew in the long run that that was going to hinder the release in some way. I just wasn't quite sure how yet.
You got to understand that these birds are coming from completely treeless, flat, open tundra habitat. They come from places where there's nothing on the horizon. And once they get south of the tundra, they tend to gravitate to places that are as open as they can find. So coastlines, open farmland, airports, which is a real problem because they're such a hazard to, the planes are a hazard to them and they're a hazard to the planes. And urban areas, if you look at it from a bird's perspective, especially kind of on the fringes of cities, you get these huge buildings with these huge flat rooftops. And if you get up at that level, you've got an uninterrupted horizon line. And also there's pigeons, there's rats, there's all kinds of things to eat in cities, not necessarily always healthy. The DC owl, I think, probably had a whole bunch of things going against it. The feather damage, to me, is really indicative of a bird that got blasted by a methane vent on a landfill. They vent off the methane and burn it, and then these posts that come out of the ground, and it's become common for open country raptors like red-tailed hawks to land on these things, and if they happen to be sitting there when the vent goes off, they get scorched. And I think that's what happened to that snowy owl even before it came to the city.
So this bird was sent to us from Washington, D.C., specifically for our expertise in replacing damaged feathers. And that process is called imping. It's an age-old process that falconers created hundreds of years ago, and we've, of course, adapted it and used a little bit more modern tools and technology to get the job done. So basically how imping works is that feather shafts are hollow, and so you can use that to your advantage to insert a pin into the part of the shaft that remains on the bird, and then into the shaft of a new feather that you want to insert. So it kind of connects them in a pin-like fashion. And so what we use is bamboo. Bamboo is like the connector that connects the new feather to the shaft that remains on the bird. And then we whittle it so that it fits nice and snug in the feather shaft, and then we glue it in at the end. And basically these feathers that I've imped will stay in the bird until it goes into a natural molt. And they will be just as functional, allowing the bird to fly and catch food and do everything it needs to do to survive.
While rehabilitators worked to return the DC snowy owl to the wild, a group of researchers had banded together to study the snowy owl eruption.
Well, Project Snowstorm had its genesis in the winter of 2013-2014 because we had the largest eruption of snowy owls in the east and the upper Midwest in at least half a century, maybe closer to a century. And really nobody saw it coming. And so when it became clear that there were thousands of snowy owls coming down into that area, I and about 20 or 30 other researchers and banders and wildlife veterinarians and pathologists got together to try to learn more about the winter ecology and the winter movements of snowy owls. It's ironic, in some respects we probably know more about the breeding ecology of snowy owls in the Arctic than we do about their ecology and their behavior when they're down here with us on these eruptions. The heart of the whole thing are these GPS GSM transmitters. At preset intervals, as frequently as every 30 seconds, it records a really detailed three-dimensional location, so the latitude and longitude on the ground and the altitude in terms of height. We're able to track the movements of these birds in much, much greater detail and much finer granularity than we've ever been able to before.
After several weeks of testing out his new feathers, the DC snowy owl was ready to get back to the wild. The Minnesota Raptor Center released the bird in late April in a spot near the Wisconsin-Minnesota border. Though it seemed like this owl had overcome the odds, it was not free of danger.
We got some sad news from Minnesota tonight, where DC's famed snowy owl has died.
The bird was found dead on August 22nd on the side of a highway not far from the release site. The owl appeared healthy and seemed to have been eating well, but its injuries indicated another collision with a vehicle. Those who work in wildlife rehabilitation know how often their work can be undone by factors out of their control.
Wildlife rehabilitation, it's tough. A lot of the birds that come in are so damaged that they're never going to be released back to the wild. So anytime one is released, it's great. It's such a success for us. We do band a number of the birds that we release, and sometimes we get band returns, a very short time later that the bird didn't survive, but other times we get band returns, 5, 10, 15 years later, and we know that bird was out and living free out in the wild for that length of time. And there's no way to tell when you release the bird. You do your best, you make sure that it is as fit as it could possibly be to return to life in the wild, and cross your fingers.
The whole goal here is partly just to satisfy basic human curiosity, but also just to get a better sense of what we need to know to save these birds, to preserve these birds for the future. Because one of the things that's become very evident in the last couple of years is that there are far, far fewer snowy owls in the world than we thought just 15 or 20 years ago. It's become pretty clear that because snowy owls are so incredibly nomadic, arguably the most nomadic, or certainly one of the most nomadic birds in the world, scientists have overcounted them. They've overestimated their population. In all likelihood, there may be no more than 31,000 pairs of snowy owls in the world. And in fact, at the low points in the lemming cycles, there may be only 3,000 to 5,000 pairs of snowy owls. And it's also a bird that, because it lives and breeds at the very highest latitudes where climate change is most evident and occurring most rapidly, it may be one of the species that's at greatest risk from climate change. That's not why they're erupting south. That's not a connection. But I think a lot of us are concerned about what the future holds for snowy owls.
I know the DC snowy owl was like one special bird, but all wildlife is special. The attention was focused on that one bird, but look around you at all the wildlife around you and protect it as you would protect that bird.